Okay, hey everyone, thanks very much for joining our Monday Mindshare. Decided to go to video with these. We're going to put them up onto the Ambassador Racing team, and also we'll send it out to our registered athletes all around the world through email. So rather than type these up, put them into a blog, we're going to do these on video. We'll see how that runs. Hey, big month this month in July. A lot of people racing all around the world. It's just awesome to see. I know Wendy Thomas and Ian Moore have got some 70.3s lined up, and Griffin is teeing up his full Ironman at Lake Placid. So I saw him knocking over some long miles on the feet just this last week. So that's great to see. And I know Debbie Collingwood from our team had a number of ocean swims lined up, although I think some of those might have been canceled on the account of COVID, unfortunately. Graham Thompson has another 100 miler teeing up for this year. So all the best, Graham, for that ultra. And then right down in Australia in Cairns, we're seeing the Smurfettes knock out their 3 marathons in 3 days. So some really cool type of racing going on around the world. Oh, hey, this Monday Mindshare, 3 or 4 things on my mind I wanted to spend a bit of time with. Let me just share this up so that we can see this, and we'll talk through some of these topics as we go through what is on my mind. So I'm getting approached by a number of athletes having some different outcomes in their racing. One race, they're doing really well. The next race, not going so well. And this is kind of popping up 3 to 4 hours into the race. And there's a consistent theme of some of the observations I'm seeing why this is the case. What is always interesting is when we have some discussion with the athletes on what's going on between what you're doing in training and what you're doing in racing. It almost, the lights go on consistently as we have these discussions where, oh man, I'm doing, this in my training. And when I get over to racing, for some reason, I thought I needed to change what I did from a nutrition perspective. What you're doing in your long, slow distance, or even your long tempo sessions in training should not be that different what you're doing race morning. And I say that in the spirit of coming into the race and also during the race. So, and by the way, as we developed this protocol and the products to support race morning and racing itself and high intensity training, at that point, it was our thought process and observations. This is what should be supported to optimize racing outcomes, performance outcomes. Dan has done some awesome work over at EndureIQ in the labs, where we now have research proof points showing exactly that this is what is going on and why you're seeing these different results relative to what you're doing pre-race and during the race. So what is it? If you go to page 17 or 18 of the optimization guide, this is really important. What we talk here about is what happens in that 3 to 4 hours before the race or race morning, and then that first hour of the race. This is not a nice to have. Even if you were a highly tuned athlete with, in terms of your fat oxidation rates, 1 gram, 1.5 gram. I think some of you listened to Matt Kerr in his video now, 1.8 grams. Even for Matt, if he was to go into a race and consume prior to starting that race a bunch of carbohydrate, we're almost certain, based on all the research now that Dan's led, that his fat oxidation would plummet down. And when I have these discussions with our athletes, both in the Ambassador team and beyond, I find that one of the most common thing that's happening is that between what they would do in training and then what they do in racing is, for some reason on race day, they feel it necessary to go and add a whole bunch of carbohydrate, or even some carbohydrate. It doesn't have to be a lot, prior to the race. And they're surprised why, when they get 3 hours, 4 hours into the race, they start having some really unpredictable outcomes, whether that is just raw performance at that point begins to plummet, They begin to have cramps. They begin to slow right down. They're out of gas. They're hitting the wall. And the reason why that is that by taking that carbohydrate prior to the race, you're triggering the insulin. So therefore, you're shutting off your fat oxidation before you even start the race. Insulin sits in the bloodstream for about 4 hours. And during that 4 hours, then you're going to largely be dependent only on your carbohydrate, or mostly on your carbohydrate. And as a function of that, you're going to deplete your carbohydrate much faster. So 3 to 4 hours in, you've gone through a lot of that carbohydrate, and then it comes down to this balancing act of taking in carbohydrates. And the problem there, of course, is that our interpretation of slowing down is I must be running out of fuel. So therefore, you take more and more, you get over that 50 grams an hour range, and you start getting into this higher risk gut problems. The gut bloats up and the race is finished, whether that's a very slow time or just a DNF full stop. It still remains as the number one reason for not finishing these races. I'll show you some data on that. We'll talk about it. Actually, the study just last week, 8 different studies were looked at in terms of carbohydrate and GI distress. 6 of the 8 studies showed that between 65 and 82% of the participants in those studies and in those races that were studied had GI distress. So it's very consistent. So if you look at the optimization guide, here's what we say. We say rule number 1 for that pre-race. So this is race morning. Race morning, do not consume insulin triggering grains or starches or simple sugars, or large amounts of dairy, which can also have the same effect. Now, some grains respond differently to different people. This is not everyone's a textbook case, and we all have exactly the same response to every grain. You should really test it and understand it. If you go to our life guide, you can pick up a cereal recipe there that has no grains in it. So it's still going to give you the satiety in your stomach, but without triggering the insulin. But some grains, even those that have a low GI response, including oats, can have a reaction. If you want to test it, real simple, get your glucometer, know what your standard wake up in the morning blood glucose is, take your cereal, whatever type of that cereal is, and see what happens at 30 minutes. Take another reading with your glucometer. At 1 hour, take another reading of your glucometer. At 90 minutes and 2 hours. And then plot that curve and see how fast your blood sugar goes up and down. If you have that massive jump in blood sugars, right, you know that that is absolutely going to switch on your insulin. And the reason it then drops back down is because insulin's thrown into the blood. And that's okay for the carbohydrate, but it has effectively shut off your fat oxidation. And for the next 4 hours, that fat oxidation is going to be blunted. Now, we talk about a life bar. Why is it important? Why is it good? And why is it showing really promising results as that pre-race, that morning meal to have prior to a race? Well, that is because if you look at the nutrition facts on the life bar, the carbohydrate is dietary fiber. It's resistant starch. That means it doesn't get broken down until it gets into the large intestine. So it has a minimal effect. In fact, the reason we called SF in SFuels is spike-free. And the reason that we started there is the first product we developed was the Life Bar. And the whole development of that was that you could take the product that would have minimal effect. I'm not saying zero because everyone's different, minimal effect on your blood sugars and not trigger that insulin response. This is why it's also good, by the way, for intermittent fasting. Fast through the night, you take a Life Bar, it's not throwing your blood sugars up and triggering the insulin. It's going to keep them relatively flat, but it's going to have, you'll see in that nutrition makeup here, it has 11 grams of fat, it has 13 grams of protein, and then has this fiber. Those 3 things, protein, starch in the form of resistant starch, and fat. They're the 3 things that will make you feel satiety and you'll feel comfortable that you've eaten something, but you haven't taken something that's going to either bloat up or trigger that insulin. That's why the Life Bar is showing really good promise. In Dan's studies also, he has shown that by taking the protein, it doesn't have a effect on depressing your fat oxidation down. So it's okay to take that prior to the race start. So the race starts. you want to give yourself 30 to 60 minutes, and it's relative to intensity, by which time you've triggered, because of muscle contractions, the GLUT4 channels to open up. It can take on the carbohydrate into the muscle cells without insulin. It's really important to understand this, because without the insulin, then you can basically be oxidizing your carbohydrate, and you can also be oxidizing your fat at the same time. So this is really important, folks. I have, quite consistently just noticed athletes having consultations, and when we drill into it, we find that they're adding things in that race morning that is putting that insulin up, and 3 to 4 hours into a race, they're having these problems. You can avoid that. This can be a secret weapon in your race. As Dave Scott would say, typically less is more on race morning. By the way, as much as there is a futile effort around carbohydrate loading the night before, it is also a futile effort. There is no reason to do fat loading on the night before or the morning of. And the reason for that is you've already got a ton of fat in your tissue to deal with. You don't need a ton of fat on race morning. All you want is you're feeling okay, you're not hungry going into the race, sip on some Train. That's going to give you a little bit of MCT. It's going to give you some electrolytes, keep you hydrated. More than anything, it's going to help you with the pre-race nerves. So that's what we're giving as advice. It's in our optimization guide, and hopefully that will help for your next race. Now, a couple of studies interesting that have just come out in the past week or two that took my attention. One of them further supports what we've been talking all the time since the development of our Train product, our Race Plus product, and in high dose in our recovery formulation, our revival formula. So, and that is about glutamine. And this study was actually done on professional basketball players. Now, we've seen this type of study similarly done on runners and endurance sports, etc. But this was interesting because, of course, basketball, highly anaerobic, high intensity, and a lot of eccentric muscle contractions, which is where you see a lot of the muscle tissue damages in eccentric muscle tissue contractions. And what it's saying in red here, you may or may not be able to read this, but I'll just read it. It's just saying that glutamine supplemented group in this study displayed significantly lower values of, and then they list several enzymes. And these enzymes and markers are proxies for muscle tissue damage. And it's basically saying that you're seeing lower values of those enzymes and those markers for muscle tissue damage than the placebo group. And in addition, they said that the adrenocorticotropic hormone, so this is like hormones that are coming out of the adrenal gland, which typically would heighten as a response to this type of exercise, etc. But those levels, cortisol levels, did not increase at the end of the study in the glutamine supplemented group. So altogether, it's saying that the results indicate that glutamine could attenuate or reduce exercise-induced muscle damage in sport disciplines with predominantly eccentric actions. So this is why in our Train formula, in our Race Plus formula, and in a high concentration in our Revival formula, we have high dose of glutamine, is really to offset that muscle tissue damage that happens through eccentric muscle contractions. Now, another study that just came out, which I thought would be interesting because it maybe just primes up some of the work we're doing on a product that has just come off the manufacturing line. We're going into packaging on this. It's a new product. I'm not going to give you all the detail about it, but this particular study talks about caffeine and medium chain triglycerides. Now, particularly MCTs or medium chain triglycerides come in, around three forms. I think there's 6 forms actually, but 3 that are most talked about: C8, C10, C12. C8, which is just referring to the number of triglycerides, and 8. And that size is shown to be most influential in terms of triggering the generation of ketones as a function of a low carb and a higher fat diet. And this is why predominantly in our train formula, our race formula, even our life product, also in our revival formula, the MCT that we use, the medium chain triglyceride that we use, is predominantly C8. And we know that this generates ketones in the body. Now, what this study is also showing that is that you can even prime that further on by the use of caffeine. And obviously, everyone I think is well aware that that can come through coffee, come through cocoa or chocolate. It can come through green tea quite strongly also. And if you read down the bottom, it's showing that in this study, the intervention with caffeine caused an increase in BHB or ketone levels in particular. The innovation with C8 highly impacted ketogenesis. And then the conclusions down the bottom, it says the present study demonstrated an influence of caffeine and MCT on the generation of ketones. The addition of caffeine showed an additive effect on ketogenic potential of MCT and coconut oil. So this is great. We kind of understood this. There's just another study that's reconfirming it. Caffeine, one of the problems, of course, challenges in if you're using it as a functional food, is that when you have a coffee or you have a tea, it's great. There's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, everyone's doing it. I'm not saying to stop that. Absolutely. One of the challenges, though, is that you never know, depending upon how it's brewed, how it's had, how it's taken, how much caffeine. It can be less and more. So what we will be working on is a product that allows you to have very measured, specific amounts of caffeine. And that is in the spirit of priming fat oxidation in everyday living. And also, as you think about, again, race morning and during the race, how do you measure out caffeine into your race formulas to ensure that you know exactly how much you're taking, and you've proved it in training that you can be optimized by taking a certain amount. So stay open to that one. It's coming out soon. I'm really jazzed about that new product that's coming out. Okay. In these Monday Mindshares, I'm also going to talk about every time a couple of recipe foods that's on my mind, and specifically I'm going to talk about today 2 simple recipes and simple foods that I advise a lot, I use a lot, and they are foods that are high in sodium. It's one thing to take sodium capsules or tablets of form, and they're fine, nothing wrong with that, but there's nothing like getting it in our foods. By the way, the Life Guide, we're going to be updating that. The last time we produced this was earlier this year. We're going to be coming out with a new Life Guide, and our Life product. It's going to have a number of incremental recipes, both in the terms of drinks and foods, to make the utilization of our Life product even broader. And particularly, we're going to be adding a whole bunch also of mocktails, so non-alcoholic cocktails, into the Life Guide to really expand the use of our Life products and also our upcoming caffeine drink product. So the 2 foods is miso soup, and it says miso soup second. That should actually be bacon and celery. And these 2 foods, as I said, very high in mineral content, very high in sodium. One of the reasons I just want to talk a little bit about this is because it's not uncommon to see that in mid-morning for low-carb, high-fat athletes, is they can feel a little down in energy. And it's typically not actually anything to do with energy itself, but it can be actually a slight drop in blood pressure. And again, by having a low-carb diet, we can see the body throw off sodium. So the importance of taking it on is even more important. Again, you can find plenty of sodium through the Life products, including our Life product itself, that you use in a lot of these recipes. A miso soup itself is very high in sodium, and it's just a great way mid-morning to just get a high dose feed of sodium into the body. And if you're looking for something for lunch that doesn't have the carbs or very low carbs and has a high dose of sodium, there's a recipe that we'll have in the new Life Guide, which will be basically diced celery, and then you basically fry up your bacon, and then you add your celery into that. You can put a tablespoon of soy sauce for even some more sodium, and then a half of a scoop of Life. And it's just a tremendous lunch to keep you through till the afternoon into dinner. Again, without the carbs, high in fat and high in sodium, and that'll keep you going. Well, hey, folks, I hope that was interesting. That's our Monday Mindshare for this week, and I'll leave it there, and I'll look forward to catching up with you soon. Go longer, have fun. Talk soon. Bye.